Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. My name is Scott Moore, and tonight I'm going to speak to you about the cloud-powered business. To start things off, let's consider the following scenario. You come into work one morning to find that everyone's being called into the conference room. As you enter the conference room, a quick glance around the room at everyone's expressions tell you that the inevitable has happened. Your local project team is being laid off. The company just couldn't reduce costs enough, stay agile enough to remain competitive in the current state of the economy. This is a far too familiar scenario, and almost daily now we hear of another round of layoffs, cutbacks, etc. Whether it's in the news or something you see on television or an article on the internet, or even friends that you know that you meet up with, it's not an uncommon story at all. There are things that a company can do to remain competitive, and they'll have to adapt in order to remain successful in this current economy. A lot of that starts with choosing the right platform for software to help keep your company able to reduce cost and remain agile in the marketplace. Before we go too much into the solution, let's talk a little bit about the problems that a traditional company faces. The first big thing that a company notices is there's a lot of infrastructure, typically in IT, just to support the business that doesn't really add direct value to the business. For example, if you need to track information for a company, you need several things. First of all, you need a database. You need a server. And then on that server, you're going to have a database. So you've got the hardware, you've got software. You'll need an application server that will interact between users and the database. And also you need the resources to help control that, right? So you've got to have a database admin, application administrator that's going to be able to set up, configure, and maintain those applications, and then possibly also customize those to help your business track more data that's specific to it. These costs are very expensive. They tie up a lot of resources in the company, and again, they add very little business value. They're basically there just to keep the lights on and keep the business in operation. Another problem that small companies face is just barrier to entry. If you're a small company, this means buying a lot of hardware up front just to get started. That can usually be a pretty hefty bill, and often delay, maybe even prevent a startup from happening just because someone just doesn't have the money to invest in it up front to get started. For the company that does get started, that capital that's being poured into the resources prevents them from being liquid, so now whenever other opportunities come up, they may not be able to take advantage of them. One of the ways that this hinders them is, again, that just the delay and the lack of being able to take action, right? So that the cost and lack of agility. The next issue that a lot of larger companies are often faced are just simply agility. They have tons of resources, they've already got servers, they've got data centers and stuff like that, but their environment is very complex and it takes them too long to make a change. The reason that is on the back end is that because there is a database server and there's an application server, and then you've got several different possibly custom user interfaces depending on which department is viewing the data, if you need to make a change, there's usually a large IT backlog because the changes are complex and they have a lot of approval processes due to the environment. And then someone has to make a change. They can't just make it in one place. They have to make changes in several places. So they have to add a field to the database. Once they add the field to the database, they have to add logic to every single page individually that field needs to be displayed on, and also how it's handled, right? Who can enter data into this field? What type of data can be entered, right? Is it free response or pick list, etc.? Either way, programming all that to make the environment work for your business, there's a lot of overhead in that. It's a very complex change, and therefore it takes a long time to get that change implemented. Sometimes too long, sometimes never. Another big problem that large companies face is downtime. Companies need to be available as much as possible, both to internal employees and their customers. So often in traditional software and IT environment, is in order to update something, you've done this with your personal computer, you get an update and you get prompted to restart your computer. Enterprise software works in much the same way. You update a database or a database server or an application, you have to restart that to have downtime. Every one of us that's used Vista before knows that, at certain times there's scheduled maintenance for Vista on Friday nights, and it goes down for several hours at a time for scheduled maintenance. And that is one of the things that plagues companies large and small with a traditional infrastructure. Another problem for companies are just basic reporting needs. Oftentimes data in a database, if the application doesn't provide out-of-the-box reporting, someone has to create reports, and oftentimes these aren't just simple, click and drag like you do in Excel. You have to write SQL queries to first accumulate the data. Most regular users can't do this, which means that a business user has to put in a request to IT department in order to build the report for them, and also even just to do minor changes to the report once the initial version is done. Finally, another big overhead in companies is once you get everything set up, you've got everything configured, it's working perfect, it's just the way you want it. Well, now you've got to mitigate the risk of what do I do if something happens to this? So you've got to have backups of every single piece of the infrastructure. You've got to have a backup of the data in the database configuration, the server configuration, and also the application and the application configuration. You've got to know exactly what version it was and have everything perfectly matched so that when you restore the data to it, that it matches up with the right version so that it's in the right format. That in itself also takes a ton of planning, a ton of resources. You've got to have extra storage space to save all those backups to, and you've also got to test the process repeatedly to make sure that it's working after each new update. So now that we've talked a little bit about the traditional problems, let's talk about how cloud computing can help solve these. So first off, with a cloud-based system, what this means is that you don't need a server to host this. A cloud-based system is online, it's publicly accessible as long as you have an internet connection, and the infrastructure is all managed for you. Everything from the data layer to the application layer, and another term for cloud computing is software as a service. And so this means as a company, I don't have to have the database, I don't have to have the server software, I don't have to set any of that up. Also don't need a specialized database admin and a specialized application admin and all the extra overhead there either. Those additional resources can now focus on the business rather than traditional IT stuff just to keep the lights on. For a startup company or even for a larger company that is looking to invest in a new platform, one of the benefits is that the reduced startup cost. So now, again, instead of having to buy a server up front and lots of software licensing up front and investing a ton of time just to set the stuff up before I can even begin to develop a custom application or tailor it to my business specifically, cloud-based software, all that's done for you, and it's based on a subscription model. So effectively I can start with a subscription today, and that levels out my cost. So instead of paying a big chunk up front and then hoping I get to use it for years and years and years before I ever have to do anything with it to get my money back out of it, now I pay a much lower fee up front, and I have a monthly recurring cost that is I can easily budget for. Another benefit of cloud computing is just agility. So again, without all the complex processes and having to manage the infrastructure, your IT staff can now focus on the business itself. What do we need to add as a business? What information can we track? What can we analyze based on this data? So one of the ways that it's more agile is when you get the reduced complexity of having to manage all the infrastructure that supports the business. The other thing is the platform itself addresses specific problems, such as we mentioned before, is that everything's seamless. So now instead of having to update something in 10 different places to get it to work, in a cloud-based system, I can typically add a custom field, and seconds later it's available to an end user, and they can start using data in that field. They can add it to a report themselves, and so that's how it becomes a lot more agile. Also, too, you don't need a highly specialized person to do it, so you could even have a semi-technical business person make some changes themselves without having to require involvement from the separate IT department. Availability is another big issue with cloud computing that you really get, or really another big benefit of cloud computing that you get. Cloud systems usually have SLAs with 99% uptime. You don't have to take them down. As I mentioned before, you can add a field live in production, so you don't even have to take the system down in order to do an update. Whenever they push out an update to their system, you get the new version of the software automatically. So you don't have to plan for the release. You don't have to do tons of testing on, what happens after we upgrade. Is everything still going to work? You basically come in one morning, and as soon as you log in, you see, oh look, they got a new interface. You've got all the updates automatically, and your business didn't have to do anything to get that benefit. Also, reporting. Reporting capability is often also included with the cloud-based applications. Again, in the on-premise world of software, traditional software, basically you had a database and you had an application, and it was always kind of this fight in between of, oh, well, the application didn't provide reports out of the box simply because they figured people would want to get down to the granular data that's in the database, and vice versa. The database tool doesn't know what the schema for the application is going to be. Therefore, it can't provide a report for it. You would have to go in and write a script to custom tailor it to the information you wanted to extract from that data. So reporting is another huge benefit, and it's also available. It doesn't have to go to IT in order to build the report, and end user also has an interface to build reports themselves. Finally, before we mentioned all the backup processes that need to be done, the backup processes, again, are automatically built in. There's redundant systems for server uptime, but also data backups. It's all built into a cloud-based platform, and it's one less headache that you have to worry about. So real quick, just to kind of recap what we've talked about of what this does is most companies are still facing traditional problems, the traditional business problems of the last decade. Cloud computing's already been proven to be successful in companies of various sizes, large and small. And finally, if you see any of these traditional issues mentioned in your company, it means there's an opportunity for you to go forward and have a plausible solution to what these business issues are. So now that we've talked through this, why should you start thinking cloud today? Basically, with the current economy, businesses and employers everywhere are facing layoffs and cutbacks, and the bottom line is companies have to adapt in order to stay successful in this environment. They still face a variety of business problems and overhead that hinder the business's efficiency. And ultimately, cloud-based software and architecture can help that company become more efficient by reducing cost and allowing the business to be more agile and thus stay competitive. Addressing business issues at your company, it can be done with a cloud-first mentality, and that's going to help ensure the success. In fact, cloud computing may be the solution your company needs to stay competitive, and you just might be saving your own job in the process by being proactive about the software architecture that your company chooses. Finally, just to kind of take a old quote here, in a lot of IT, there's always an old adage that no one ever got fired for buying IBM. The new version of this saying would be along the lines of, you'll always stand proud for choosing the cloud. And that's simply because of the power of this and what it means for your business, and hopefully not only help you keep your job, but also make you more successful as well as your company. Thank you. Have a good night.